Now let's discuss relationships among the different types of validity. First, let's start with internal validity and conclusion validity. They are both similar in a certain way. They are both threads to drawing correct conclusions about the covariation about a treatment's effect, meaning how do cause and effect relate to each other. On the other hand, there are fundamental differences between both. Internal validity concerns really with sources of systematic bias. We have a fundamental problem in interpreting the experiment. That's why we may make incorrect causal conclusions. On the other hand, conclusion validity concerns with sources of random error and with the appropriate use of statistics and statistical tests. So it's a very different field. It's a precondition for conclusion validity, but by itself, it's looking into a completely different direction. Similarly, we have relationships between construct validity and external validity. For example, both concern the contingencies on which the causal relationship depends. So without having those adequate, we cannot draw causal conclusions. There are differences, however, for example, to the extent to which a real target population is available or can be known or understood. In external validity, it's often pretty easy to generalize to specific populations that have a grounded existence, meaning there is a fundamental concept that can be clearly identified, like all developers or so. In construct validity, this is much more difficult because this is really what is the specific kind of group this is representative for. Often you will also have to make some priority among validity types. This will impact how you plan and create an experiment. We will discuss this later on when we discuss experimental design. In particular, increasing one kind of validity may decrease another kind. Example would be the use of undergraduate students in an inspection experiment will probably reduce heterogeneity within the group and give a reliable treatment implementation. This may lead to a high conclusion validity, but as I said earlier, it may also lead to reduced external validity, meaning it's not as obvious, at least, that any results from such an experiment will also translate to non-undergraduate, meaning graduate students, or to professional developers. As a result, we need to do trade-offs. We may have different types of validity that can be prioritized differently depending on the purpose of the experiment. For example, theory testing, like we do there we have internal construct, conclusion, and external validity. This would then be probably the order of priority, while if we want to do testing for applications, then it's more like internal, external, construct, and conclusion. How do you deal with this in practice? Often throughout a longer experimental program, you will actually do all of that with different studies. For example, first you try to understand whether your theory is really fully correct, and then you are more doing experiments of the kind of theory testing which have, for example, higher internal and construct validity, and then you migrate over to applied testing and focus very much on external validity. So there's not necessarily only a single experiment on which a complete study depends. Let's do an exercise. Suppose we are using students instead of developers for a software engineering study. Which kinds of validity may this negatively influence? You basically heard about this already. Now, stop the video for a moment, think about it, and then return. Welcome back. We mentioned it a few times already. External validity would be potentially problematic. With that, let me summarize. We have discussed certain threats to validities. These are basically all the issues that may negatively influence or impact the form of validity relevant to a study. And we identified 4 types of validity. The analysis of threats to validity is a fundamental part of any well-done empirical study. However, it's not like we can say if there are any threats to validity, then it's a bad study. No, actually quite to the contrary. There will always be threats to validity. If these are adequately identified, if it is described how they have been handled, and if they are well documented, that is when we should have trust in an experiment within the limitations that are identified. If there is just a saying, well, we handled all of these threats and there is no remaining problem, that's when to be distrustful of the results, because that is hardly true. So throughout this chapter, we discussed what are different types of validity, why is it important. We identified 4 different types. We identified also some threats. This has not been a complete list, so please, there are many books out there. If you do an experimental study, return to this section. This was just to make you knowledgeable and to help you understand there are these kinds of issues you should be aware of. It's not a full description of all relevant issues. There are also relationships among the 4 types of validity, and there's a priority that should be taken into account. There's a lot of literature on this. Please have a look at some of those books, especially if you are actually doing some sort of empirical work.